let us take a minute to introduce ourselves. My name is Simon Whatson. I'm a Vice President at Efficio Consulting. I've been a procurement and supply chain consultant for 15 years, and I've supported a number of clients on their journey of procurement transformation, from diagnostic phases to savings programs to building teams to putting in place long-term solutions for tracking savings, doing opportunity identification, training of procurement people, and I'm based in Efficio's London office. Pleasure to welcome Andrew as well. Andrew, if you'd like to say a few words about yourself.
Yeah, hi Simon, I'm Andrew. I'm currently Director of Procurement at Marks and Spencer's. Been here about 4 years. We've made a lot of changes in the way we do procurement at M&S in that time, and some of those we can talk about later. Previously, I was Director of Procurement Business Efficiency at ITV. I was there for getting on for 10 years, and prior to that, I had various roles. I was head of IT outsourcing at UBS Investment Bank. I was there in 2008, so I was there in the tough times. And before that, I started my career at BT on the graduate training scheme as part of the procurement graduate training scheme. And I've been at various other companies, including British Airways and Vodafone in my career.
Perfect, thank you. And now you're a webinar star as well, Andrew, to add to that list of impressive achievements. So good to welcome you to the panel. I guess maybe let's start off by just explaining the background to this webinar and how it came about. We've actually had quite a lot of interest in this webinar on the topic. I think it sort of resonated with quite a few people. And there's a few things that have led to us having this webinar. One of those was a podcast that actually, Andrew, you gave with one of my colleagues, Spotlight on Procurement. So you came in and talked about your Marks and Spencer experience and the importance of getting the basics right and the kind of approach you've had there to that. At around the same time, just purely coincidentally, I wrote an article for Efficio's external source magazine, which talked about how going back to basics is key for organizations, or at least getting the basics right is important, especially in terms of costs and savings. And I think, what we both noticed was that you don't often hear such an unapologetic focus on cost as much anymore. So to have kind of 2 bits of content in the space of a few months, it seemed like a good opportunity to come together and, I guess, discuss this a little bit further and explore it a little bit deeper. So we're very pleased to have the opportunity to do that. So let's get into the substance here, and we thought we'd just take a little bit of time, and Andrew, please do chip in here with just defining what we mean by going back to basics. And I think for me, it's all about being able to walk before you attempt to run in procurement. And I think specifically, I would define that as some of the things that we see on the left-hand side. So, making sure that there's a laser focus on optimizing cost ahead of anything else, making sure that we're having tangible impact and that we're actually making changes that people feel in the business, and also making sure that we've got credibility with stakeholders, that we are doing things that they believe in, and that they can see and believe in the results. And then, of course, the fourth one there is around having the end customer in mind in terms of what we're doing. And whilst those things are not going to be new to anybody, I sometimes find that we maybe lose sight of the importance of those before moving on to some of the more, let's say, shinier causes that procurement sometimes gets asked to asked to get involved in, whatever that may be, whether it's ESG, whether it's digitalization. Procurement functions often talk about expanding the remit of procurement and sort of enhancing their own profile for the sake of enhancing it. And I think that's really, for me, what's really important to bear in mind is being able to walk before being able to run.
Yeah, I agree with that. So my 2 penneth on this is, when I think of back to basics, and I think Simon's right, it's not really trendy most of the time when you go to conferences or hear webinars, the people are talking about ESG agenda, or they're talking about diversity agenda, and all those things are really important. But to talk about those things as a procurement team, I think you need to get the foundations right. And I always talk about having like solid foundations to build everything else on.
Yeah.
I think you almost go a level below this. You can, if you think about the story you're trying to tell as a procurement team, you almost go a level below this. Okay, you think about, you've almost got to think about what is the purpose of your procurement team in your organization. And the procurement policy should be written with that in mind. Your procurement process should be written with that in mind. You've got to think about everything, knitting it together. And it all comes down from, you know, it's like anything you do, what are your objectives? Or write everything with the objectives in mind. You know, what does your CFO care about? In my experience, most CFOs, they'll want their procurement team to deliver savings. And the other stuff's good, and you want to build on it, and they'll care about it. But you build credibility with senior members of the C-suite, and especially the CFO, by demonstrating you're adding value through savings. And not only savings, actually, that's the other thing I would say is, that's my point about understanding the business and knitting all this together as part of a story, because, you know, increasingly organizations talking about cash. We had a big focus on working capital a couple of years ago as a procurement team. It drove us a lot of credibility by adding cash to the business. And that allows the board to think about different investments. It allows the board to talk about, you know, should we be paying dividends? Should we make acquisitions? All of that comes through increased focus on cash. So my experience is CFO, the board, they want to see savings. They want to see them hit the bottom line, but they also want you to consider what the macro state of the economy is, where the business is in that, where we are in the business cycle, and what the business is trying to achieve. And procurement shouldn't be standalone. It faces into those issues and faces into those challenges and faces into those objectives. And then you become a part of the business, a crucial part of the business.
Yeah, I think one of the things you've just said there, you know, Andrew, I think which really resonates with me is around making sure that you know what it is your business cares about and wants. And I think sometimes I feel like procurement does deserve a little bit of sympathy, because I think occasionally the expectations on procurement, especially these days, is so high. And I do remember quite, you know, it's one of the things I think I won't forget is we did a study last year, and we asked a bunch of senior executives and people in procurement what they saw as being the key priorities for procurement in the coming year. It was one of many questions we asked. And I was expecting the kind of nice answer where you kind of get 2 or 3 really clear answers that are, you know, common across all people, that, you know, whether it's cost or something else. But actually we ended up looking at a bar chart which is pretty much flat. And almost, you know, all of the different things that people were saying, whether it was cost, whether it was ESG, whether it was, you know, driving product innovation, whether it was shaping organization-wide strategy, whether it was ensuring governance in the supply chain, you know, they're all kind of equal. And it kind of makes you realize that actually a lot of different people have a lot of different views on what it is procurement should be doing. And I think that's sometimes why procurement finds itself in this position of maybe overreach and trying to do too much, you know, before really figuring out what it is the business expects of it.
I think that's right. And I think that's why it's really important to think about your organization. And I always think this is true about procurement, full stop. The best way to do procurement is the way that works for your organization. So, you know, when you do a survey like that and you get lots of organizations coming in, that's right. But then you need to find out what matters in your organization. And a good example of this is, and it's kind of a personal example to me, is when we came out of COVID, M&S, and obviously retail, that was a tough period for any retail organization. That's not news to anybody. We got a new CFO at M&S, and remember the first catch up, we were talking about savings. We were talking about how he sees a direct line for our savings to his P&L, how his finance managers need to see that, and what the process is for making that happen. But he also talked about working capital, because at the time cash was even more important. I remember we went off, did a program, changed payment terms, changed our processes, and we increased cash by a lot. And I came back a year later, and we were just talking to the CFO, and I was talking to the CFO, and he just made the point. So, Andrew, you just recognised what I cared about, and you went off and that just like full stop gives you credibility, and that may not be cash in the organisation that you work in. There are plenty of private companies out there who've got procurement teams where cash isn't the most important thing, right? But it's what matters to your team. It might be ESG, it might be something else. My experience is most CFOs start with this back to basics savings. How you influence at this point here, earning credibility with stakeholders. That's done by understanding markets, understanding their problems, understanding their objectives, and aligning procurement's objectives with the stakeholders. Because once you've done that, my experience with procurement people, nearly all of them are very delivery focused. If you align their objectives to the business objectives, you'll start delivering those objectives. And it sounds simple, but I think too often we can be guilty as procurement team almost sitting as an ivory tower saying this is what procurement do.
Yeah, and actually it's the fourth point on this slide on the bottom left here. It's kind of customer service 101. It's understanding what your customer wants, and in the case of the CFO being your customer and who you're reporting to, if they need cash, then understanding that and then shaping your objectives around it and your activity around it is key. So no, I think it's I think that's a really good example, Andrew, and thanks for sharing it. And I guess the other thing I would like to deep dive a little bit on this importance of kind of credibility and cost in particular. And just I wanted to just share an anecdote. When it was a few years ago, I attended a procurement event where there was a panel of very successful CPOs actually, and what I was really interested by was a particular question that was asked around should procurement be measured on savings and cost, and I was really interested to see how people would answer that, and just bearing in mind these were successful CPOs. And I remember the first couple of people who responded to the question gave sort of answers that indicated that they'd kind of moved beyond that, and it was no longer important. There was a bit of nuance to their answer, but they talked much more, or felt they certainly seemed more comfortable talking about some of the other causes that they'd taken up, supporting their company's efforts in really driving forward the ESG agenda. One of the CPOs talked about supporting as well safety because of the sector that they're in. But I think the third person who responded kind of really nailed it for me, and this was a CPO of a supermarket who just said, look, I think all of these other causes are things that procurement can add huge amounts of value to, but in order to get the credibility and to earn the right to go and do those things, you almost need to start your journey with proving that you can be trusted on cost, and provide that kind of commercial conscience to the organization, and that's done through understanding your costs and your suppliers, and driving through optimization initiatives. And I thought that was a really good answer, because I have found that sometimes savings and cost have become kind of dirty words in some cases. I think in some of the smaller organizations it is a focus, but in some of the bigger organizations, it seems to be more fashionable to talk about causes which are a bit more virtuous than just cost and profit. So I was really reassured actually by the supermarket CPO who gave that answer. But I also thought it was really good that he kind of had the courage to say that in a room full of a couple of hundred professionals in procurement. And I know, Andrew, from the webinar, the podcast, sorry, that you did with us, that you have made sure that that your function is credible on cost before going and doing other things, I believe.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So, you know, when I joined M&S, one of the first things we did was rewrote the definition of savings. I think that's key, right? It needs, and you always have this debate with your team, actually, with the procurement team, because they'll have objectives, quite often objectives of savings. So their view will be, we need to maximize what we can claim as savings, but you need to think about this in terms of outward looking.
Yeah.
The procurement team, you're outward looking to the rest of the business. You need to have a credible process and a credible measures of what savings are, and there needs to be a direct line between when you're talking about numbers and finance or the business are looking at their budget, they can see the impact into the budget. Yeah. That's what gives you credit. And you know, there's always a conversation, isn't there, about P&L versus cost avoidance, and that cost avoidance can be a really good measure of savings. I always think it's a really good proxy for the value that procurement add.
Yeah.
And when we're doing things, but actually, what the business cares about is that direct line of sight between what you're doing and the impact you're having and their budgets. And you need to, you know, like I said, when I was at M&S, we started off by saying this is how we define savings, this is how we measure savings, and this is how we work with finance to agree the impact on the P&L.
Yeah,
and that's, I've worked, luckily or unluckily, I've worked for 3 different CFOs since I've been at M&S. Every one of them, the first meeting I've had has asked me whether finance sign off the savings.
Yeah, exactly. No, I think that's absolutely spot on, and it's amazing how easy it is, I think, as procurement professionals that we almost kind of forget that final step of ensuring that others in the business are aligned on the savings that we're signing off. Because sometimes actually a procurement savings sign-off process is not, it can be straightforward, but it's a different type of language to what finance would potentially normally speak. You know, where they're talking about, you know, P&L, as you say, whereas the reality is that the work that goes on in procurement is at a much more granular level than the categories that are in a P&L. And so if you're, you know, doing an initiative on, let's say, I don't know, a subset of the logistics spend, it's not going to be, you know, sufficient to just to be able to show the kind of high level P&L entry for logistics and what's happening to really kind of show the impact of the procurement work that's happened. And so having to kind of take stakeholders, in particular finance, through that is such an important part of getting credibility. And you know, there have been many you know, CPOs, I think, who have claimed savings numbers that they've clearly believed, but the business doesn't quite buy into. And I think that really kind of impacts the credibility and therefore their ability to go and do other things within the organization and be really kind of viewed as that strategic partner.
I think that's spot on. One of the things that is probably true about most organizations, and you need to understand as a procurement person, is when finance or the business are looking at their P&L, it's unlikely to be a line-by-line supplier entry.
Yeah.
When we talk about contracts, we talk about suppliers, and we talk, even if they really are year on year reducing cost, you need to be able to communicate to the business how that impacts what line of their P&L. And so there is a little bit of work up front, understanding how they're measuring, understanding that kind of detail of how their P&L works.
Yeah.
And then, you know, you start there and you move, once you've got that understanding and credibility, you start there and you start moving on to, you know, influencing the budget. You know, what can it be next year? Where can you take costs down? Because that's where you really get impetus to change the way the business does things. And, you know, you can start off by taking money out of the business. You know, people talk about changing, almost getting up the value chain as a procurement team, and that's right. And at M&S, we call that alternative thinking, but you can call it what you want. But actually right, we're looking at the whole business process. But to do that and to change that and to really make a business more almost consultancy business impact, you really need a good understanding of how the P&L works, because that'll be the that gets you the in.
And what sort of practical steps have you taken, Andrew, in M&S, just in terms of sort of, savings guides or just practically speaking, if people are listening to this and then maybe understanding the concept, how could people get started on this to get finance on board and get on the same page as finance?
Well, I think I'd probably go back to what I said at the start, really. I'd start with what the purpose of procurement is. And what the purpose of procurement is in your organization. That might be savings, it might be control. It could be different for different organizations. I think you start there, and you start with almost a high level strategy about what you're trying to deliver. Out of that falls what your you need a policy, but I don't think you assume that a policy that another organization is using or a policy that you might get from a consultancy works, because you needs to drive the procurement relevance in your organization. So I think you start there, and then like I said, you start with a clear definition of what savings are, and a clear measurement process, and a clear sign-off process, and that builds the foundations. And also, most people, when they join an organization, or when they're in an organization, you get procurement people coming from different organizations. You need to be able to explain it and what you're about to new people, to people who are coming in and trying to hit the ground running. I think there's just a clarity of purpose and relevance that you need to build, and you do that with those quite simple building blocks. The other thing that I would say that is really important is what comes back to the purpose a bit, but what's our USP? At M&S, we see ourselves as the best negotiators in the business, and I think you've got that on one of the lines there. That's our identity. We run what we call Ideal, which is a negotiation skills training course for the rest of the business. It gives us credibility because people see us go there. We give them steps of procurement. We make it more scientific. Everybody thinks they can negotiate, right? We've all bought a car, all bought a house, right? But actually, getting people to think in a dispassionate way, taking emotion out of it, looking at these things, planning negotiation, looking at roles in a negotiation. It builds. What it does is it builds the procurement role up, because people see, actually, we don't want them just knocking 10% off at the end. We want them part of the planning process, because a negotiation plan is a detailed and complex exercise. So I think that finding something like that you are seen as the leaders in the organization, and we run this negotiation course, and quite often people come and ask us to go and speak to their teams and run the course. We've done it. We've been to Ireland. We've developed it so that we can talk some of the international teams, and they just see it as real value add. And I think that it comes back to basics, right? We might have ESG, all these things, but everybody sees us as good negotiators.
Yeah, no, it's very good. And just sort of one of the other themes that I wanted to just explore with you, Andrew, was around to what extent the potential wider remit of procurement actually can come back to cost. And I guess what I mean by that is, we've just talked there at length about the importance of being credible on savings and cost, and making sure that people are bought into what we're claiming, and we have a policy, and we have ways of getting people on the same page. But then, as also mentioned earlier on, there is a plethora of other things, and there's a couple of them on this slide, but it's not exhaustive, that procurement has been getting involved in a lot, especially in more recent years. we had digitalization, which was a big theme for a number of years and still is for a lot of organizations, and procurement. ESG is something we've mentioned a number of times just on this webinar, and it's something that procurement teams are getting asked more and more to get involved in, not least because a lot of the ESG impact of an organization is typically in the supply chain. Supply chain risk is something else. To what extent, do you think that these things are, standalone, let's say, causes versus actually all of these link back to cost? So to give an example, one could say that doing ESG and focusing on ESG is just the right thing to do because it's the right thing to do for the planet, and therefore we should do it. But then there's another school of thought that says, whilst there may be some organizations that do that, most organizations are motivated on profit. And so any kind of initiative on ESG will have some kind of profit motive behind it, whether it's breaking into new markets, whether it's retention of current customers, whether it's being able to do things more efficiently. And so therefore, if procurement can help to, let's say, calculate that business case, and help organizations understand the benefits of doing these, the commercial benefits of doing some of these initiatives, that actually it would be easier to make progress with some of these things because the business case, the commercial business case, is clearer. It'd be interesting to kind of unpack that a little bit with you and get your views on that.
Yeah, I think it's complex and hard. Sometimes these things are just hard, right? But actually, I think you're right. I think one of the things, like digitalization, for example, people often talk about systems and we need a new system where it's going out of support, or there's this new system that make things easier for you. Well, it needs to be linked out to a real output, and nearly always the output is some kind of cost lever.
Yeah.
I think you can lose sight of any of these things. If we do a lot on supply chain risk. We've got a big supply chain, ESG, digitalization. When you work for a retailer and online is a big part of our makeup, it's really important. But it always needs to be brought back to, so what is the business case? For example, one of the things we do as a team, we measure us. One of the ways we measure ourselves is to look at how much you'll have to sell, knowing what our margin is, how many savings we make, how much extra you'll have to sell if we don't make those savings, right? There's a direct link to the front office and to the stores. And the same with supply chain risk. People talk. I remember again talking to the CFO. We'd done a lot of work on supply chain risk. We'd analysed all the suppliers. We'd done some segmentation. His first question is, so what then? What's the output? Yeah. What are you actually going to do? And it's almost like bring it back up to that level with everything. How does it affect cost? And even if especially on things like ESG, there might well not be a saving from doing these sort of things, but there is a cost calculation you're making.
Yes.
And back to that gives it credibility. It also stops it getting out of control. It also stops it. You're saying, well, I'm talking about digitalization. I'm going off to do this AI thing. Well, with what benefit?
Yeah, exactly. What's the value case for that? Yeah, what's it going to bring, or is it just to be able to say we've got AI?
Yeah, exactly right. So, and I think that I think my view on this is, and this is probably true about all parts of the business, but especially in procurement, because we're a cost center, you've got to be able to bring it back to cost. You've got to be able to bring it back to a business case. And you've got to be able to bring it back to, if not a direct saving, what are the outputs that the business is achieving through you doing these initiatives?
I agree, and I think procurement's ideally positioned to do that. And I think that is a huge. I think some of the procurement functions that do that today, they do a huge service to their businesses because it helps the business to really prioritize and understand the relative benefits of the different initiatives that they have at a corporate level, being able to really understand the kind of cost and value trade-offs of the different things. And I think procurement was initially invented as a function, at least strategic procurement was, to to support businesses to drive better commercial value. And so it seems to me to be an extension of that, a very logical extension of that.
No, I'm not. What I'm not. I wouldn't want people to get me wrong. What I'm not saying is that things like ESG risk are not important. They're clearly really important and are
Yeah.
only get more important. But you need to counter that with what are the outputs and what we're trying to achieve to make sure it's focused and to make sure what you're not doing is lots and lots of slideware that has
Yeah.
no impact on business. That's
But
what and that's what I try and avoid.
I completely agree. And I think my point is, I think we'd actually make more progress against some of these initiatives if, as organizations, we understood the commercial business cases better. And I think it would actually help, because, as you say, these are all important initiatives in their own right. But if the value case is not clear, that's when they can sometimes slip down the corporate agenda, potentially. So good. Okay. Well, look, we've got 10 minutes left scheduled, and so it would be a good time to go to questions. So we have got a couple in already, but if you do want to ask any questions, please do feel free to put them in the chat, and they'll get passed through to us. So one question we've got here, actually, Andrew, maybe you want to have a go at this first. I've got a view. Are there any times when cost is secondary in terms of a consideration for procurement?
I think look, the obvious example there is kind of the ESG agenda, but even there I wouldn't put cost as secondary, because if you think about ESG, I think, like Simon said, right, it's the right thing to do, and we've got to do something. This is not like it's not like a negotiation. We've got to do something. Totally understand that, but I think the point both me and Simon are trying to make here is not that cost is secondary, but if you define things in terms of cost and in terms of business benefit, then you're more likely to be successful. You'll also put the resources in the right place. How many resources do you need on ESG, and what benefit are they delivering, rather than we're just going to do ESG because we should, and we've got this big scorecard and lots of slides.
Yeah.
And so while I can understand where sometimes you're saying, well, it's not just about cost, we should do the right thing, and sometimes that will cost us more money, you're still making a considered decision because you know that it's costing you a little bit more money to do that thing. Yeah.
No, I agree. And I think my kind of 2 pence worth on that, which is quite similar, is that for example, there's also, regulation which comes in, and clearly that gives companies no choice but to take a course of action. But you could also say that even that ultimately comes back to cost, because there's a cost of not following regulation in terms of, fine, ability to operate, reputation in the market. So no, I think it's good.
Also, there's also, in that scenario, there's a cost to how much you do. Do you do the minimum? Do you want to be best in class? And actually, that's why it's important, because what you want to do as a business and as a procurement team, as a subset of the business, is understand and make a considered decision about, again, how much resources, how much you do for that regulation. You clearly got to meet the minimum requirement.
Yeah,
that things work, but there's always an ability to do more or less as an organization.
Exactly. Another question that's just come in. So what is actually driving the trend among procurement thought leaders to move beyond cost? And have you found it challenging by going against this trend amongst your peers? So what's driving the trend among procurement thought leaders to move beyond cost, and have you found it challenging to go against this trend? Andrew, do you want to have a go at that one again? Or
I want to be glib. I just think it's not interesting. I think if you go to a conference and you want to talk,
yeah,
it's natural to try and want to talk about something different you're doing.
Yeah, exactly.
That's just, I mean, we've all done that. I spoke at the CIPS conference last year and I talked about alternative thinking, because I was trying to show how my team were trying to push the boundaries. But I'd counter that by saying, that's kind of fine, actually, because actually those forums are about getting ideas, thinking about new things, challenging
Mm.
yourself. But I think that within an organization and actually within procurement circles more, we should be not embarrassed and open. And procurement's about saving. Fundamentally, you start off by procurement's about saving money.
Mm. Agree. And I think actually, I think what we're not saying is that procurement can't be doing these other things, right? I think what we are saying is that it should really only do those other things once it's got the basics right, and once it's credible on cost. And I think in that respect, Andrew, in your example, talking about alternative thinking at a conference, yeah, I think you should be completely entitled to talk about that if you've got um, your kind of house in order, which you do at M&S. And so,
and you keep a focus on keeping that house in order, so you
yes,
don't let
exactly.
it go. And then the other things, like my point is, the other things, you don't let them balloon to be over resourced. It's that keeping a conscious effort to know what you're about, and the foundations are right. The foundations are always going to be there, but we're going to now try and push these other areas, which we think will be a business benefit. And by the way, when I talk about alternative thinking, it comes back to cost. It just comes back to cost rather than just price. It comes back to cost by changing business processes and making the business more efficient. And it really is just widening how we attack cost in the business.
Yeah. Yeah. There's questions coming in here. We've only got 5 minutes, but there's a couple of really interesting ones, Andrew. And I think you're in actually, I know I've given you two already, but there's one I think you'd be in a good position to answer. One of them is, what guidance do you have? So this is getting into the detail, probably picking up on what you said about calculating savings earlier. What guidance do you have for, it says for a startup, but I'm assuming this means buying a new product from a startup where there's no baseline for savings. What sort of guidance do you have for people there when there's not a product that's been bought in the past, so therefore there's no real benchmark?
Yeah, I'll always start with the budget.
Yeah.
And what I do accept is in that scenario, I'm sure the person will come back to me and say either in that scenario the budget isn't
It's
very
wrong.
difficult because people don't always know how to set the budget, and I totally accept that, right? And that's where we get to, and I mentioned it at the start, that's when we get to cost avoidance. And I think we measure cost avoidance, okay? Don't get me wrong, but I think there's cost avoidance and there's cost avoidance. And I think talking about ballooning, you've got to be really clear about how you measure and get the buy-in from some stakeholders to how it's a proxy for the value you add. I think a good example of cost avoidance that I always give when people in finance criticize it is inflation. We talk about inflation mitigation, right? If you've got a clause in the contract that says your contract goes up by RPI and RPI is 12%, and you get it down to 4%, that's real value to the business, but it won't hit the P&L.
Yeah.
No one's saying that isn't good value. And the same, you go through a competitive process. It's a new supplier. It might be a digital supplier, but it might be a startup. You negotiate down the price, and you get better terms on payment, and you reduce risk in the contract. All those things I would measure, and I would call out as a success.
Yeah.
I think I would just try and be clear on a case by case basis what you've done. Sometimes, rather than having a big number, anecdotally talking about the story that you've gone through to get the benefit, that has a lot more power. And so, when we are talking at the end of the year about some of our cost avoidance savings, we'll give examples of, this is what we did, this is all the work we did, this is the amount of market knowledge we had to bring to it, and that kind of anecdotal story gives you just people really understand and can see then the value.
Very good. I hope it does as well. I wasn't the one who. I'm sure they'll let us know if it didn't. We've only got 2 minutes left. There's quite a few questions. We won't get through all of them. There's one more which I'm happy just to quickly take, and then I think we'll have to wrap it up. Which is, how does procurement evaluate the value of innovation projects when cost or savings are not the primary objective for procurement? I mean, Andrew, feel free to chip in here, but I would say this kind of comes back to the point I was trying to make earlier, that procurement needs to really kind of evaluate total value as opposed to just cost. And it needs to support the business to understand the value case of, let's say, bringing some new product to the market. What impact is that going to have on their ability to potentially get into new markets, to expand the customer base, to do things more efficiently, and not just be thinking of the kind of cost price as the only thing it's being measured on. And that's where I think sometimes this kind of ownership for the value case is not clear sometimes in organizations, but I think it's an excellent opportunity for procurement, which is ultimately a commercial function, to take that lead.
I agree.
Good.
Be commercial advisors, and actually, that's the point about bringing yourself up the value chain. You're part of the business case. You're part of thinking about the solution. So it moves away from just, I got 10% off.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us for this webinar. We're going to have to bring it to a close there, I'm afraid. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak to everybody. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, you'll get a recording of this in the next 48 hours or so. And we very much hope you enjoyed it. And we hope to see you at a webinar again soon. Thank you very much.